I want to conclude this section of the course with an exercise, and the purpose is to review the anatomy we've sculpted up till this point, because sculpting it once is great, but it's not really enough to solidify that knowledge in your head. Doing it again, and frankly, again and again and again, is what will solidify that. And so I want to guide you through at least one more time. And what we're going to do is select a random set of eyes, a random nose, random mouth, random ears to apply to this sculpture. Because chances are those will be different versions of these facial features, and you'll be forced to analyze the anatomy again and apply that knowledge in a new way. And another thing that I want you to get out of the exercise is the experience where small facial feature tweaks can result in very different looking people. Because it's good to experiment with facial features so that your characters don't all end up looking very similar. And then the third aspect of this exercise is that it's an introduction into likeness sculpting, where oftentimes as a character artist, you may want to sculpt a celebrity or sculpt someone specifically, where translating photographic information into a 3D sculpture is very important. And we'll be going over likeness in depth in another video, but this will be a small taste. So a couple files that I want you to be aware of. In my little image viewer down here, let's control spacebar to maximize it. And I've created 4 different reference sheets, a set of random eyes, a set of random mouths, random noses, and random ears. Now, you'll notice that the ears have far less to choose from, and that's because I don't see ears as being consequential to the recognition of a person, so I prioritize it less. So for the sake of this exercise, I want to tweak the ear, but generally it's your eyes, nose, and mouth that have far more consequence on how a person looks. And so in this video, I'm going to demonstrate this exercise where I'll be selecting a random set of eyes, let's say letter C here, and I will be applying that to our sculpture. And then we'll do the nose and mouth and ear. So one thing that I want to do before we begin sculpting is the decimation optimization. So I'm going to select our head, add the decimate modifier. If I go to my wireframe, especially the ear, has a lot of extra geometry, and there's still a lot in the neck as well. So we're at about 213,000 polys. I'm just going to take this to 0.5 to get it around 100,000 polygons, and that should be plenty to maintain all of our definition. Yeah, I think that's good. So I will apply that. Also, I want it to be optimized not only for sculpting in this situation, but for the sake of switching between this version of the sculpture and what our new version will look like. We can use mesh shape keys for this. So if I select our mesh data panel, or rather object data for a mesh object, and under shape keys, I'm going to click it twice. Once to create the basis shape, and second to create the new shape, which I can name new face. And this will function like a Photoshop layer for our sculpture. So if I set that at 1, jump over to sculpt mode, and disable dynamic topology, because we're just moving features around. We're not sculpting new features, so we don't need to update the topology. We'll turn off dynamic topology. And now if I simply drag out a bulge and go down on our shape key, you can see how that morphs in between. And so on the new face is where we will sculpt our changes. And that's just kind of a fun thing to have for a before and after analysis. Also, this means we can jump to object mode and right-click Shade Smooth, so we can sculpt on a smooth version rather than the faceted version. And now let's dive into these specific eyes. So one of the first things that I look for in a set of eyes is the slant. Let's try and display this very clearly. I'm going to create a new annotation and call it slant. All right, change the color to a nice bright blue or teal. And if I use the annotate line tool, and connect a line from the corner of the outside eye to the caruncle, that gives us the slant of the eye. And this one is clearly slanted upward toward the nose. Whereas if we do the same thing to letter D, that's slanted downward. Okay, so that's a pretty easy thing to pick up on. If we look at our actual sculpture, this looks like it's slanted significantly down. And so I'm going to, with a broad brush size, I'm going to drag the outside down and the inside up a little bit. Okay, subtle changes. And you can see that that already changes the demeanor, but there's more to adjust because the next thing that I look at, let me add another annotation layer, is the height of the eye. Let's change that to a green. So for me to analyze the height of the eye, I draw a box connecting the top lid, the eye corner, bottom lid, and inside corner. Okay, so that presents a rectangle showing the height. Now, if we apply that, say, to letter A and do the same thing, it's going to be a much thinner box. Okay, and then furthermore to letter E, this one is much wider. So drawing that rectangle can identify the height. Another aspect to the height is how much of the iris is being eclipsed. So in this letter C that we're using, it seems that there's more of the upper eyelid covering the top half of the iris, and it's just barely touching the bottom edge of the iris. And so if we look at our sculpture, the upper eyelid seems pretty good, but the bottom eyelid, there's actually a little bit of white showing in the eye. So let's pull that up. There we go. And the way that it eclipses the eye kind of gives this droopy, almost lackadaisical demeanor. And in fact, I think we're still open a little bit too much. So let's bring this down. I can either bring it down like this or try bringing down the entire thing with a big broad brush. All right, that actually looks more like the same sort of demeanor from the photo. Yeah, definitely a little more lax. And then apart from the slant and the height of the eye, this is where I start going down the anatomical list and looking for the shape of each anatomical feature as well as the definition of each feature. For example, the superior palpebral fold up here. Let me switch to my annotate tool, grab my pen, and if we make a new layer for this, we can see that the shape for this is a very flattened ellipse. Okay, now if we look at our sculpture is pretty much just a slant upward into a curve. Okay, so there's a lot to adjust about this. And the way I'm going to do it is using our Shift-A mask by topology. So I'm going to hold my cursor in the middle of the superior orbital fat and hit Shift-A. And that will start to drag out a mask. And since we tucked that geometry under, the mask should stop exactly where we want it to. All right, now if I turn off the mask overlay, I should be able to drag up the outside edge and achieve this shape without modifying the eyelid. Okay, so there's a little bit of an issue there we'll be able to solve, but I want to pull up. Looks like the mask is stopping that inside edge too. Well, that's good enough. The hardest part is this outside edge where it was closest to the eyelid. So let's Alt-M to clear the mask. We can re-enable our overlays, and I'm going to hold Shift to smooth this out. Then maybe pull this little corner up. And it can definitely get tricky trying to keep this contour smooth and the eyelid, leave those alone. But that's actually looking a lot more like our reference. Looks like this fat is also a little more plump. So with my inflate brush, I'm just going to plump that up overall, smooth it out. And then if I turn off the annotation over here, it also gets very, very dark on the inside edge of that superior palpebral fold. There's a little bit of a dent right there. Okay, so with my Draw Sharp brush, I'm going to hold Control and push that inward to give it more depth. There we go. I think that's looking a lot more like the photo. Now, for the upper and lower eyelids, let's take a look at those shapes. Now, in mine, it looks like I'm favoring the peak towards the inside of the eye, whereas it looks like in the photo, the peak is more towards the center of the eyelid shape. As far as the bottom, it looks like the peak downward actually does favor the outside, but on the inside, it comes up significantly more than what I have. And then for the caruncle, mine's dipped too low, so we'll pull it up. That looks pretty good. Now for the inferior palpebral fold, there's definitely more meat being pushed outward. So I'm going to take my inflate brush and push this out directly under the lower eyelid. And then it also seems to get more subtle towards the outside. So let's smooth that out. And then it's also thinner in general. Mine dips too low. So let's pull it up. There we go. That's looking a lot more like the photo. And let's do a before slide and after. It's a pretty significant shift. Definitely looking like a different person just in the eyes. So let's see. What does the brow look like? The lines are maybe less defined in the photo, so I'm just going to smooth these lines out. Maybe bring the inner brow up a little bit. Yeah, I think that looks good. Okay, let's move on to the nose. Now, I'm not like Xeroxing the photo, but I am taking visual cues and applying it. So I'm not judging this based on how exact does it look like the photo, but more, is it that different from the original? And yes, it's quite different. So I'm happy with that. I've gone over the anatomy, refreshed all that in my mind. I'm ready to move on to the next feature. So let's switch over to the nose. And we need to pick one. So I'm going to maximize this. And it's a very similar approach to the eye in that I look for major features first. Things like the length and width of the nose. I'm going to go with number 3. I like this one right here. Okay, so it looks a lot shorter than my nose and wider as well, or most likely a combination of the two. There's also a couple features that make it look distinctly segmented into thirds. All right, so there's this kind of angle here. Whoops. Let's turn on the anatomy annotation. So there's a divot here that kind of segments it into 1/3, right? Bridge of the nose and up, bridge of the nose down. There's also the point where the nostril connects, and that's kind of another visual third, and then the bottom. All right, so 1, 2, 3. Also, the width is much wider in terms of the nostril. The tip of the nose is far broader than what we have. And also the shape of the nostril. All right, so the peak outward kind of favors the bottom side, right? This peak right here. All right, so that should give me enough to get started. Let's minimize that. And I actually want to hide the annotation. Just look at the nose. Okay, so we talked about the peak being pretty strong at the top. Just gonna pull that in a little bit. There's also not so much of this bump outward, so we can just smooth that out, hold shift. Maybe even the fill brush to get rid of that divot. Smooth all of it out. There we go. And the width of the nose, definitely need to bring it out. Focusing my broadening at the tip of the nose. That is so much broader than what I had. Smooth it out. All right, we have a ridge in the center. That looks pretty good. Similar to what we see in the photo. Okay, now for the nostril shape. That's going to be a big difference. I'm going to pull out the peak more towards the bottom and give it a distinct slant. Maybe even a little more extreme than that. Okay, now for the slant of the nostril, you can see how mine's kind of flat across, a very uniform, albeit squished ellipse. Well, this one has like a sharp peak on the outside and then slants downward. All right, so let's pull up the outward edge and then pull down the center contour. Also, the connection from the columella to the philtrum is much sharper. So let's use my Shift-C crease brush. There we go, pull that nice and tight. It also seems to be a little more peaked downward. And that is a huge difference. If we turn that off and on, already I'm not completely happy with it in terms of how much it looks like our photograph, but it does look so different from what it was originally. Just gonna smooth that little knob out. And also keep in mind, this is only the difference from the front side. We also need to address the difference from the side. Get rid of that little kink. Always be mindful of what this looks like from multiple angles. Now let's look at the 3 side view, 3 on the number pad, I mean. And at the bottom of this ref sheet, I've got a line of profiles. So we just need to pick one of those. I'm gonna go with 24. That one is definitely different. It has this kind of bird's beak hook downward. So let's use 24. And, you know, keep in mind that none of these are related. Like, this is not the actual side nose for any of the front views. They're just random, okay? So being random, they're not gonna line up necessarily if you try and orthographically match them, but just take the visual cues and apply them. So clearly, a visual cue for number 24 is that the front of the nose dips down, whereas mine is kind of dipping up. Not dipping up, but pointing upward, right? You can see the peak. So we want to change that. With my grab brush, I'm going to pull it down. Okay, let's smooth out the top edge. And now we've got a nose pointed down. Let's give it a convex curve. There we go. Now this might be pointed out a little bit too much, or extending out a little too much. So I'm going to bring that in, but definitely pointing down. And what a different nose. Hopefully you see what I mean, that all these small tweaks make a huge difference to how the person actually looks. And maybe overall, if we look back at number 3, my nose is just a little too long. So let's pull the whole thing up. All right, I've got a very broad brush size, just pulling the whole thing up. Yeah, the nose does so much to what a person looks like. And I think we can call that done on the nose. Let's move on to the mouth. And we need to pick one. Let's go with K. That looks significantly different from what my current lips look like. J looks pretty similar, but K is quite different, okay? So the things I'm looking for in broad terms are Cupid's bow, right? So in my sculpture, it's a very defined Cupid's bow, very high peaks at the base of the philtrum. But in this set of lips, there's very little Cupid's bow. It's there, but it's like it's been squashed, all right? So that also brings the thinness of the lips. My sculpture, they're much more full. Here, they're much thinner. And so those are the main things I'm looking for at the lips. Besides the anatomical terms like the tubercle in the middle here, very defined on our sculpture, hardly existent on the photograph. Okay, so let's start there actually. I'm going to pull out and smooth this tubercle until it's pretty much barely there. I'm gonna push in that crease a little bit more. It's kind of a shading artifact due to the bad triangulated geometry. It's not that big of a concern, but I really want to make that peak far less prominent. Okay, so we've kind of smoothed out that central tubercle. I'm gonna spread out the peaks of Cupid's bow. And in fact, they're really not even peaks. They're almost entirely rounded. All right, so let's make sure to do that. And they also are much broader, much wider. So we'll pull that outward. Keep in mind, this is a curved surface. So you can't just pull it straight out in X. You need to kind of pull it in line with the lips. And then let's see, anything else? Yeah, so the initial curve of Cupid's bow also seems to pull outward a little bit more. Definitely more plump on the outside for this tubercle. So we'll plump that out with the inflate brush. I want to eliminate this very distinct crease in between tubercles, and that's looking pretty good. Perhaps the biggest thing to change is going to be flattening the lips. All right, so I'm going to grab my pinch brush and I'm going to lock the x-axis and the y-axis. This will make the pinch simply pull down and not go back or go left or right. And so with the pinch brush, I can just start to pinch the lips down, make them a whole lot more thin. There we go. However, the bottom lip, I feel like still needs to come down. I'm going to switch to my grab brush. Oh, also, look at the asymmetry. So this is perhaps a good example of where we can turn off our X symmetry, and this right peak on the bottom contour of the lip definitely comes down further. They are pretty distinct. I need to turn off the lock axes. 'Axes. They're very distinct peaks as well. more so than what I had initially. And then it looks like even on the top lip, you know, we can pull this down more so. The screen left side of the lip is thinner than the screen right. Interesting. All right, so we've introduced some asymmetry, and let's take a look at the before and after. Small tweaks, totally different person. I love this game, honestly. It's so much fun to do this. And that looks pretty good. I'm pretty happy with how different that looks. But there's also side views of the lips included in this ref sheet. So if we go with V, for example, the bottom lip is very notably backward set compared to the top lip. So we can introduce that if we want. Whereas right now they're pretty much lined up. Typically the bottom lip is a little lower or a little more backward than the upper at least. But in the case of this person, let's see. It's really far back. So let's do that. Why not? And you can't just pull the lip back. You sort of have to pull the chin back initially, and then that will allow for the bottom lip. Oh, wait, I forgot to turn on symmetry again. All right, so for here, I undid that. Let's turn on X symmetry and repeat that process. Pull the upper lip forward. There we go. Just slightly offsetting those lips a bit more drastically changes this. And I mean, while we're on the mouth, might as well fill in the cleft of the chin. Let's use our fill brush, fill that in, and then inflate to give it just a simple round plump. And do a before and after slide. Excellent. Now let's move on to the ears and switch over to the ear ref sheet. And similar to the eyes, one thing that I look for is a slant. All right, this is a very big feature. If I turn on our annotations, we'll turn on the blue for slant. If we connect the peak of the helix to the peak of the lobe, that gives us an idea of a slant for the ear. And you can trust that when I lined up these ears with the bigger face, that all faces were aligned to face directly forward. They're not looking up or down. And so compare 1 to the slant of number 2. Those are actually, I guess, pretty similar, but the lobes look different. But number 3 is even more slanted. 4 probably matches a similar slant to 1 and 2. But let's go ahead and tilt it further back like number 3. With ears, honestly, since I pay less attention to them as consequential to recognition of a face, my main priority with ears is that the anatomy is correct, less so about the intricate details. But for the sake of this exercise, I would like you to do it for reviewing the features. So we're going to pull back the helix, pull forward the lobe. All right, give it much more of a slant. And then from here, it's kind of an exercise in either plumping out the details, right? So for number 4, in general, the features are much plumper, whereas number 3, all the features are quite thin. And so let's go with the plump, since right now I feel like mine's somewhere in the middle. So if we plump out with the inflate brush, that should be enough to get us somewhere in the ballpark. Maybe not. Let's instead use the grab brush to pull out the helix width. Wow, it's significantly larger in the photograph. Almost looks like an infant's ear a little bit. The shape of the lobe, it seems to favor the front side, and it thins out horizontally, something like this. And then the antitragus has much more of a point. The tragus is much more subtle in the photo, so let's just smooth that out, give it less of a peak. And the bottom of the antihelix snuggles up really close to the helix on the outside. There we go. So we've kind of given it a different overall shape. However, maybe part of the plump feeling in this ear is that it's just more compact as well. It's not quite as large overall. I think that that is evidenced. I need to inflate the inside and Y split of the antihelix. And then from the front side, I have some front angles of the ear. And we can just sort of pick one. I feel like number 5 actually matches the plumpness of number 4. So we'll go with that one. And most notably, the bottom side of the antihelix needs to come in and be a lot less lumpy. While the outside of the helix can pull out further. Definitely a lot of lumpiness from the optimization that I did with a decimate modifier, but still. The bottom side of the lobe, where it connects to the helix, that needs to come out. There we go. I think that looks pretty good as a different ear. Go back to the before and after. And even the isolated facial features makes a huge difference. I keep saying this, but I always, I guess, have a lot of fun. And making different faces is not that hard. It's all based on having good anatomy. Then you can slightly move around different parts of that anatomically correct structure, and you get a totally different face. Beyond the individual features, you know, we can pull up the jaw, like make a really big brush size, and like bring up the jaw slightly. And now we've got a more compact head rather than being long. We can pull up the shoulders, give him a shorter neck. And then also we can thin the neck, make him less of a toned, slightly muscular guy. Smooth out some of the features. Give him less of an Adam's apple. See the before and after. And yeah, I'm really happy with this being totally different person. And for you to do this exercise, again, I think it's going to be a good review for you to go over these features and also free you up to play around with different noses, different eyes. And, you know, I could just play with this stuff all day, kind of smooth out the laugh line, make them feel a little bit younger. Also, you can pull back the temporal process. Yeah, just slightly moving these features around. Vastly different appearance. Okay, so that is the exercise for you. Now, I want to clarify a couple questions you might have. All of the facial features in the reference sheets come from male, female, and all ethnicities. It's just a random collection. Now, personally, I think for the sake of this exercise, you can pick any of them. Doesn't matter if it's female, male, or another ethnicity. Just pick and choose and play around with the features. Remember, it's more important that you analyze and apply rather than worrying about gender or ethnicity. We're going to go over those things in a later video, but for now, you can really just pick random, or you can probably tell which ones are male and female for the most part, and you can just stick to one gender or the other, and sort of, you know, play the lottery to see what your person ends up looking like. So have fun with this exercise, solidify that knowledge by running through the facial features one more time, and I'll see you in the next video.